Ever feel like you're stuck in a rut, no matter how hard you try? Like the world keeps spinning, but somehow you're bolted to the ground with invisible chains? You're not alone. A surprising number of people live their lives shaped by a mental pattern that's as quiet as it is powerful. It's called learned helplessness. And while it sounds like something you'd pick up in a dull psychology class, it's actually something your brain may be acting out without your permission. Here's a shocking truth: your brain is built for survival. It's constantly scanning for patterns, cause and effect, wins and losses. But sometimes, especially when it's been worn down by failure, unpredictability, or pain, it begins to think there's no point in trying. Not because there isn't a point, but because it's been trained to believe there isn't. And when that happens, the most capable parts of you start to shut down. You retreat, not because you're weak, but because your brain mistakenly believes effort no longer matters. Feeling overwhelmed and powerless? You're going to learn how to start dismantling that narrative. Tonight, you'll explore the roots of learned helplessness, how it shows up in your choices, your habits, even your body. And, most importantly, you'll begin to see how it can be reversed. Slowly. Gently. Like peeling away a fog that's kept your strength hidden. Picture yourself standing in front of an elevator that never works. You've pressed the button 100 times before. It never came. Eventually, you just stop pressing it. Even when it's finally fixed, you assume it won't help. So you take the stairs. Every day. Tired, angry, confused, still avoiding the one thing that might have made life easier. That's the kind of rut we're talking about. You probably won't know this, but even small, everyday decisions, like skipping lunch, ignoring texts, or staying in bed when you're not tired, can be subtle symptoms of a deeper mental withdrawal. It's not laziness. It's not stubbornness. It's a survival mode that has overstayed its welcome. Before you settle in, feel free to like the video if it brought you a little peace, and if you'd like to join us again, we'd love to have you back. Subscribe when you're ready. No pressure, just rest. Share something if you feel like it. Let's slowly drift into tonight's quiet moments together. You start to notice the pattern, not just in the big dramatic moments, but in the small ones. The coffee you don't make because it won't help. The messages you don't answer because, why bother? The walk you skip because it won't fix anything anyway. Learned helplessness rarely shouts. It whispers. It blends in. And it often wears the disguise of realism, when really, it's just resignation dressed in grown-up clothes. Psychologist Martin Seligman coined the term learned helplessness back in the 1960s, but the idea has gained new relevance as we understand more about how the brain processes failure. Essentially, when you experience repeated negative outcomes, especially ones you can't control, your brain starts to form a map that says, trying doesn't change anything. And once that map is drawn, it becomes your default setting. You still make choices, sure, but now they're filtered through a silent expectation of defeat. Here's something interesting: in everyday life, this effect shows up in subtle self-sabotage. You don't apply for the job. You don't ask the question. You lower the bar before the world can knock it down for you. But what's actually happening is a deep conflict inside the brain. One part still believes in possibility. The other part keeps pointing at past evidence and whispering, "Don't get your hopes up." And this quiet internal tug-of-war? It's exhausting. That's why learned helplessness doesn't just affect motivation. It drains your energy, shifts your posture, even dulls your senses. It's not just in your thoughts. It's in your muscles, your breathing, your tone of voice. You might be sitting in a perfectly good room, with plenty of exits, but the doors look locked because your brain assumes they are. There remains considerable disagreement about how much of this helplessness is hardwired versus learned over time. Some argue that certain temperaments are more prone to it, like those with high neuroticism or anxiety sensitivity. Others believe it's almost entirely based on experience. What most agree on, though, is this: helplessness isn't your natural state. It's a learned response. And that means it can be unlearned. A quirky fact you might not expect: some researchers have tested learned helplessness in fish. Yes, Fish. In one experiment, fish were trained to swim through a maze. But when the rewards were removed and the routes blocked over and over, the fish simply stopped trying, even after the obstacles were gone. It wasn't about logic. It was about memory. Even a fish can be trained to stop hoping. And you? You're far more complex than a fish. But it still creeps in. Maybe you've had a string of job rejections. Maybe your relationships always seem to collapse in the same way. Maybe you grew up hearing, it doesn't matter what you do. Whatever the source, the result is the same. You start to expect failure. You stop experimenting. You shrink your world. You might find yourself saying things like, I'm just tired, or, it's not worth the effort, or, I already know how this ends. But underneath all of that is a brain that's been taught, over time, to conserve energy by avoiding pain, even if that pain isn't guaranteed. It's safer, in some twisted logic, to not try at all than to try and be hurt again. That shift in energy leads us into something else, the origin story. Where did this theory begin? And how did dogs in a box, yes, literal dogs, help us figure it all out? But before we go there, just pause with this. If you've ever felt that quiet withdrawal, that heavy feeling of, what's the point, it doesn't mean you're broken. It means your brain has adapted. Too well, perhaps. But adaptation is reversible. And your strength has never really left, it's just been sleeping. It all started with dogs. Not exactly your usual bedtime story, but stay with me. In the late 1960s, psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer ran a series of now infamous experiments that would forever change how we understand motivation, stress, and behavior. The setup? Dogs in harnesses, small electric shocks, and an unexpected result that, to this day, ripples through our understanding of human psychology. Picture it, you're a dog in a box, already a weird day. You're placed in a chamber where occasionally, a mild electric shock pulses through the floor. In one version of the experiment, you can stop the shock by pressing a panel or jumping a barrier. In another version, you can't. You're trapped. You try a few things. Nothing works. Eventually, you give up. Here's the twist. Later, when both groups of dogs were put in a new chamber, one where everyone could escape by jumping over a small divider, the dogs that had never had control before didn't even try. They just laid down and whimpered, even though escape was possible. It wasn't the shock that broke them. It was the repeated experience of their actions not matching. And that's the beating heart of learned helplessness. When you've been in enough situations where your effort led nowhere, your brain starts to generalize. You begin to assume all future effort will be useless too, even when the rules have changed. Now, you're not a dog in a box, and no one's zapping your floor, hopefully, but the same mechanisms still apply. Maybe your version is a toxic workplace. Or a parent who never noticed your efforts. Or a string of relationships where nothing you did could make things better. Over time, your brain begins to predict futility. It's trying to protect you from pain, but it accidentally walls you off from growth too. Just a quirky detail, those same dogs, after being placed gently over the escape barrier once, suddenly remembered they could act. With just a little help, one simple successful experience, they snapped out of it. That's a big clue, helplessness isn't permanent. Sometimes all it takes is one changed outcome to rewrite the brain's script. The issue has sparked significant intellectual debate over the years. Some scholars argue that these experiments oversimplify complex emotional states, reducing rich inner experiences to stimulus-response cycles. Others raise ethical concerns, understandably, about how we treat animals in psychological research. But the core concept, the generalization of powerlessness, has held up. It's been replicated in humans, children, elderly adults, even in work and school environments. You see it in classrooms. A student who keeps failing tests eventually stops trying. It's not that they're lazy, it's that they've come to believe their studying won't make a difference. You see it in relationships. One partner does everything they can to fix things, but nothing works. Eventually, they emotionally check out. And you see it in health. A person tries diet after diet, doctor after doctor, and when nothing helps, they just stop seeking solutions. Here's something interesting: learned helplessness isn't just about giving up. It's also about the loss of expectation. The part of your brain that's supposed to track cause and effect, mainly your prefrontal cortex, starts going offline. It stops looking for solutions. It stops weighing options. Instead, it defaults to inaction. Why bother trying to swim when you already feel like you're drowning? This mindset can seep into your language, too. You start using phrases like, "I can't," "there's no point," or "it always ends like this." These aren't just complaints, they're cognitive shortcuts. Little declarations your brain makes to avoid wasting energy on doomed efforts. The brain, always the efficiency expert, doesn't want to spend calories on tasks it believes are fruitless. A key takeaway: helplessness is not a flaw in your character, it's a learned neural response. And that distinction matters. Because if it's learned, it means it was conditioned by experience. Which means it can be reconditioned with new experiences. Let's add a splash of fringe history here. Did you know that in the 1800s, something like learned helplessness was described in spiritual and philosophical texts as quiet despair? Writers like Soren Kierkegaard and even early Christian mystics referred to this sensation of passivity and resignation, not as laziness, but as a spiritual ailment. They described souls stuck in passive suffering, not because they lacked faith or will, but because their sense of purpose had been numbed by repeated disappointment. Long before brain scans and experimental psychology, people were naming this exact fog. And today, we have a clearer picture of how this fog forms. Once your brain has been conditioned to believe you can't change things, it changes how you process the world. Even good events, like praise or a lucky break, get filtered through a negative bias. Your mind shrugs them off, saying, "Yeah, but that won't last," or "that was just luck, not skill." You become allergic to hope. That's why healing from learned helplessness isn't about cheerleading yourself into forced optimism. It's about slowly, deliberately, collecting new experiences where your actions do matter. Even tiny wins start to rewire the map. Remember the dogs? One gentle nudge over the barrier was enough to spark action again. You don't need grand victories. You just need one small success that your brain can believe. As your mind drifts deeper, another layer opens. How does this map of helplessness get drawn in your brain in the first place? What parts of your mind are responsible for connecting effort with outcome? And how can those connections be revived when they've gone dark? That brings us to the biology behind it, the neurons that surrender, and the ones that can be brought back online. You're about to enter the brain's command center and see where helplessness lives, sleeps, and sometimes hides in plain sight. Now you find yourself inside your own head, not just metaphorically, but literally. Let's tiptoe into the circuitry that makes learned helplessness stick. Because if you've ever felt like your brain just gave up, that's not just a feeling. It's a real, physical event happening between specific clusters of neurons. Some light up with effort. Others fizzle out in the face of too much failure. And tonight, you'll watch that process unfold from the inside out. At the heart of this story are three key players: the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the dorsal raphe nucleus. Don't worry, this isn't a pop quiz. But knowing who's running the show helps you understand why things sometimes go dark. First, the prefrontal cortex, your brain's CEO. It handles planning, decision-making, and, most importantly here, interpreting outcomes. Did I do something right? Was that failure my fault? Is there a chance this could work next time? This region is the optimistic strategist of your mind, always running calculations on what's possible. But when helplessness takes over, this part of the brain doesn't just go quiet, it gets overridden. Enter the amygdala, your brain's fire alarm. It's emotional, reactive, and deeply tuned to fear. When you experience repeated stress or pain, the amygdala starts to dominate the narrative. It screams danger even when there isn't any, making it harder for the rational prefrontal cortex to cut through the noise. Here's where it gets a bit wild. Studies show that in states of learned helplessness, amygdala activity increases, while prefrontal engagement decreases. Your ability to plan, evaluate, and try again literally shrinks, while your emotional response, especially fear and anxiety, intensifies. It's like your brain swaps a flashlight for a foghorn. Less clarity, more alarm. And then there's the dorsal raphe nucleus, a less famous but crucial structure deep in the brainstem. It's one of the main sources of serotonin in the brain, yes, the same serotonin tied to mood, motivation, and calm. In experiments with animals subjected to inescapable stress, this region lights up like a Christmas tree. But not in a festive way. Overactivation of the dorsal raphe nucleus has been linked to passive coping. In other words, it's the biochemical root of why even bother. Here's a quirky tidbit: rats placed in an unsolvable maze eventually stop moving. But when neuroscientists silenced the dorsal raphe nucleus during those tasks, the rats kept going. They didn't give up. They kept trying. Just like the dogs, just like you, when one part of the brain quiets down, hope sneaks back in. A long-standing controversy surrounds just how permanent these brain changes are. Can long-term helplessness cause structural changes, like reduced gray matter or altered neural connectivity? Some researchers say yes, especially in chronic depression. Others argue that many of these changes are reversible with the right environment and support. What we do know is that functionally, the brain adapts, sometimes too well, to patterns of futility. But here's something most people miss: these changes aren't about laziness. They're adaptive. Your brain is trying to protect you. It thinks, every time we try, we get hurt. Let's stop trying. So it shuts down the parts of your brain that waste energy on planning and evaluating. It's not malfunctioning. It's just making a tragically overcautious decision. It's kind of like those motion sensor lights that shut off when no movement is detected. Your brain thinks, well, nothing changes no matter what I do, so it powers down that whole area. But the second you start moving, literally or metaphorically, it has the ability to switch back on. Slowly. One flicker at a time. Here's something interesting. Neuroimaging studies in people recovering from depression show increased blood flow and activity in the prefrontal cortex after just a few weeks of consistent behavioral therapy or small wins. That means even tiny changes, getting out of bed, taking a walk, completing a task, can start turning the lights back on. But remember, when you're in it, it feels impossible. You don't want to try. Not because you're lazy, but because your neurons have become used to failure. They've lost the expectation of reward. They're no longer sending that crucial signal of effort equals possible success. And what about dopamine? You'll meet that player in more depth soon, but spoiler alert, it doesn't even bother showing up when your brain's learned that success is unlikely. Dopamine is like your brain's internal cheerleader. But if no one's scoring goals, the cheerleader just packs up and leaves. This might explain why even positive encouragement sometimes feels hollow. People can tell you, you've got this, or just try, and instead of feeling inspired, you feel numb. That's not a character flaw. That's a neurochemical state. When the brain is caught in a loop of futility, cheerleading doesn't register as actionable. It feels like background noise. You might find this surprising. Even just visualizing success can start to disrupt the helplessness pattern. Mental rehearsal, imagining a successful outcome, has been shown in brain scans to activate some of the same reward circuits as actual success. So even when action feels impossible, thought can begin the reset. As your thoughts slow and your breathing deepens, keep this in mind: your brain is not the enemy. Even in its most defeated moments, it's trying to keep you safe. But sometimes, the safety it offers is a trap of its own making. A well-padded cell lined with low expectations. That leads us gently towards something more subtle: the effect of chronic stress. Because if your brain has been conditioned to give up, it's often because it's been under siege for too long. That siege rewrites how you interpret risk, reward, and reality itself. And in that battlefield, stress hormones are the messengers. They carry fear, urgency, defeat. But they also carry opportunity, if you can learn to read them, and eventually, calm them. So as your awareness drifts from the wiring to the chemistry, we'll slip into the next layer of the story: how stress tightens the grip of helplessness, and what it does to the stories your brain tells about the world. Stress. The word alone might tighten your shoulders just a little. It creeps in during deadlines, arguments, traffic jams, or the quiet panic of an uncertain future. But stress doesn't just rattle your nerves, it reshapes how your brain works. And when it's chronic, ongoing, and unresolved, it becomes one of the key drivers behind learned helplessness. Like a river carving into stone, stress wears down your mind's sense of control. Let's picture this. You wake up to a full inbox, your car won't start, someone texts you with bad news, and, somewhere in the background, your brain is firing up a biochemical cocktail: cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine. These hormones are designed for emergencies. But in modern life, emergencies come every hour, not every once in a while. So your system never resets. That constant state of alert changes your brain's architecture. The amygdala, the one we talked about before, your internal alarm bell, gets bigger and more reactive. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the one that plans, evaluates, and soothes, shrinks. Yep, stress can literally shrink the very part of your brain that would normally help you cope with stress. That's like cutting the brakes because you're speeding downhill. Now, what happens when stress goes on for weeks? Months? Years? Your brain begins to normalize the chaos. It learns to expect that things will go wrong. It stops looking for a way out, because trying has become exhausting. In psychology circles, this is sometimes called allostatic overload, when your body and mind simply can't reset between stressors, and your normal becomes survival mode. Here's something interesting: people living under long-term economic strain, caretakers for chronically ill loved ones, and individuals in emotionally abusive relationships all show remarkably similar neurological patterns. Elevated stress hormone levels. Decreased motivation. A heightened sense of vigilance paired with low emotional energy. It's a cocktail for helplessness, and it doesn't care how strong you were to start. Just a quirky detail: elephants in captivity have been observed displaying a kind of learned helplessness too. When they're young, trainers tie them with heavy chains they can't break. As they grow stronger, the chains are replaced with ropes, easy to break. But they don't even try. They just stand there. Because their brain says, "We've been here before." Escape is impossible. Sound familiar? There remains considerable disagreement about how much chronic stress is shaped by external circumstances versus internal interpretation. Some argue that resilience is the real differentiator. Two people might endure the same situation, but only one develops helplessness. Others believe that context is king. If you're trapped in a no-win system, your brain's retreat is completely rational. Probably, it's a bit of both. But here's the catch: stress doesn't just make you anxious. It teaches your brain to misinterpret signals. Under chronic stress, even neutral events start to look threatening. A delayed text feels like rejection. A passing comment sounds like criticism. You're not paranoid, you're just operating with an alarm system that no longer knows how to turn off. And this distorted lens makes problem-solving feel pointless. Why bother trying to fix something when everything looks broken already? Why open yourself to hope when stress has trained you to expect disappointment? Let's go one layer deeper. Chronic stress also affects your hippocampus, the part of your brain responsible for memory and learning. Under long-term cortisol exposure, the hippocampus begins to shrink, making it harder to form new positive memories or to recall solutions that worked before. So not only do you stop expecting good outcomes, you also stop remembering that you've had them before. It's a neurological trapdoor. That's why learned helplessness can feel so complete. It's not just that the future looks bleak. It's that you can't even remember a time when it didn't. And you know what happens then? The brain stops investing effort. This is where the effort discounting effect kicks in, a subtle bias where the brain starts seeing effort itself as unpleasant or wasteful. So even tasks you can do start to feel harder, heavier, more draining. You might still go through the motions, but without hope or curiosity. Like walking on a treadmill you forgot how to stop. But here's where the story shifts. Because even when your stress responses have been hijacked, even when your motivation has evaporated, there are still ways to begin gently reversing the effects. It starts with the smallest spark, predictability. The brain craves it. Studies show that even tiny routines, a consistent wake-up time, a repeated movement, a stable meal pattern, can begin to calm the stress circuits. Why? Because they reintroduce a sense of control, however small. In fact, researchers working with trauma survivors often begin with body-based regulation before jumping into therapy. Things like breathwork, yoga, walking, or repetitive motion help regulate the autonomic nervous system first. Then the brain starts reactivating more complex processing like reflection, planning, and hope. You might find this surprising. The mere act of naming your stress out loud, I feel overwhelmed, I'm stuck in this loop, this feels pointless, activates the prefrontal cortex. It brings language into the mix. And language, even the smallest word, is an act of reasserting control. A foothold in the fog. You don't have to be fearless to change. You just have to notice that stress is no longer serving its original purpose. It's supposed to help you survive. Not convince you that surviving isn't worth the effort. And that's the turning point. Once you realize stress is a storyteller, and not always a trustworthy one, you can start to question the script. That script, by the way, is heavily tied to dopamine, your brain's pleasure and reward chemical. It's the part of the story where trying becomes meaningful again. When your brain learns that effort equals reward, it sends dopamine as encouragement. But under helplessness, that signal gets lost. So as your thoughts drift from the chaotic chemistry of stress, the next stop is your reward system. Why does motivation vanish when helplessness takes hold? And what happens when you reintroduce small wins back into the cycle? Because dopamine doesn't leave forever. It just waits for a reason to come back. So here we are at the reward center, your brain's internal casino, bakery, and cheerleading squad all rolled into one. This is where dopamine hangs out. And dopamine, as you'll quickly see, is not just about feeling good. It's about expecting good. And in the grip of learned helplessness, that expectation dies off. The lights go out. The cheering stops. Dopamine works like this: your brain makes a prediction. If you think an action will lead to something rewarding, you get a little hit of dopamine before the reward even arrives. That's what drives motivation. It's why you get excited when you smell pizza even if you haven't had a bite yet. It's the hope chemical. But when your brain no longer believes that your actions lead to rewards, the system short circuits. You trudge through tasks. You stop anticipating pleasure. Even enjoyable things, like seeing friends, taking a walk, finishing a project, lose their shine. That's called anhedonia, a dulling of the ability to feel joy. And it's one of the key indicators that your dopamine pathways are out of sync. Here's something interesting. Scientists have found that people with a history of repeated failures or uncontrollable stress show reduced dopamine transmission in areas like the nucleus accumbens, a region tied to motivation and reward anticipation. It's not that the brain can't produce dopamine. It's that it stops sending it out when you expect the worst. An odd but true fact: in one study, mice were placed in a T-shaped maze. One path led to a treat every time. The other led to nothing. After enough unrewarded attempts, the mice stopped going down the treat path, even when the treat was returned. Why? Because their brains had already learned that reward wasn't guaranteed. And with that shift, dopamine stopped flowing. No prediction, no motivation. This effect is mirrored in humans who suffer from learned helplessness. You stop getting that little internal spark when a new opportunity arises. Someone mentions a job opening, and your mind goes flat. A friend invites you out, and you feel nothing. Not rejection, not fear, just that fuzzy, gray meh. The brain has, essentially, deactivated its curiosity. A long-standing controversy surrounds whether low dopamine causes helplessness or whether helplessness lowers dopamine. It's a chicken and egg situation, and scientists are still unraveling the loop. But what we do know is this: once you believe your effort won't pay off, your brain stops predicting rewards. And once that prediction stops, so does the motivation. You might not realize it, but your daily habits are all tied to dopamine predictions. Why you reach for your phone. Why you check the fridge. Why you start a new project. Your brain is always weighing, what's the potential payout here? If it doesn't see one, it won't fire that signal. And that's when your days start to feel hollow. But here's the hopeful part. Dopamine systems are trainable. You can recondition them. Just like you once learned to expect disappointment, you can relearn to expect satisfaction. And you don't need fireworks to do it. The secret is micro rewards. You might find this surprising, simply checking off a task. Yes, even writing something like, make tea, and then doing it, can trigger a small dopamine release. That's why productivity apps feel so addictive. It's not the task. It's the completion of the task. The moment your brain realizes, I did something, it offers a small treat. That's how you begin to reverse helplessness. With ridiculously tiny wins. Not because they matter on paper, but because they start to remind your brain that effort can equal success again. It's not about thinking positive. It's about proving to your brain, again and again, that your actions have an impact. That button you push. It works. That step you take. It leads somewhere. That call you make. It shifts something. Every time you confirm that, your dopamine system stirs back to life. But of course, you're not a robot. You can't just hit the motivation button and get moving. That's where emotional context comes in. Your brain doesn't just ask, is this rewarding? It also asks, is this safe? That's why helplessness and anxiety often show up together. If your system doesn't feel safe, even small rewards won't register. It's like trying to enjoy a cupcake while your house is on fire. That's why researchers studying motivation recovery often pair dopamine-boosting techniques with environmental safety cues. Quiet lighting. Calming routines. Predictable outcomes. These conditions help the brain lower its alarm bells, so the reward circuits can come back online. Just a quirky detail. In one experiment, researchers used video games to track how dopamine responded to unpredictability. They found that unpredictable rewards, like random loot drops or bonuses, actually boosted dopamine more than guaranteed ones. So yes, your brain loves surprises, but only when it feels safe. Without safety, unpredictability turns into chaos. And chaos feeds helplessness. Now here's a little real-world clue. If you've been stuck in a helplessness loop, you probably know what you should do: exercise, socialize, eat better, but your brain doesn't want to. Not because it's defiant, but because it doesn't see the point. That why bother feeling. It's your dopamine system going dormant. Your job isn't to push harder, it's to make the outcomes visible again. Even something like logging your daily tasks, yes, the boring ones, can start to rebuild that visibility. You start seeing the link between action and outcome. That's the antidote to helplessness. Not motivation from nowhere, but evidence that your actions shape your world. And slowly, that evidence starts changing how you feel. You get tiny bursts of anticipation. Your mind starts projecting into the future again. Not dramatically, maybe not even consciously, but something reawakens. And that's where things shift. Because when your brain learns to hope again, even just a little, everything begins to feel more possible. As your awareness softens into this understanding of effort and reward, we gently turn now towards something deeper, the shadow of learned helplessness that often stretches into mental health conditions like depression. Where helplessness becomes not just a habit, but a lens through which life is interpreted. And in that lens, another set of brain changes takes hold. So let's walk quietly into that territory next, the slow echo of helplessness in the experience of depression. You might not notice it right away, but helplessness has a voice. It's quiet at first, barely a whisper. You can't fix this. It's too late. Don't even try. Over time, that whisper grows into a background hum. A kind of mental white noise that follows you from room to room. And when it fully settles in, that's when you begin to feel not just powerless, but flattened. This is where learned helplessness and depression start to overlap, and sometimes become indistinguishable. Depression isn't just sadness. It's an erosion of belief, specifically, the belief that your actions matter. That anything you do will change how you feel. You're not necessarily crying every day. You're not always visibly upset. Often, you just feel blank. You stop trying, not out of rebellion, but because your brain has decided, without asking your permission, that it's not worth the energy. Here's something interesting. In modern psychiatry, the concept of learned helplessness has been a major model for understanding depression, especially the behavioral kind. Back in the 1970s, Seligman and others extended their dog experiments to humans. They found that people who were exposed to uncontrollable negative events, whether physical discomfort, harsh criticism, or impossible tasks, began to show signs of depression. They weren't just discouraged. They were stuck. And not just mentally, neurologically. Scans of depressed brains often show the same patterns as learned helplessness: reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, an overactive amygdala, disrupted dopamine and serotonin signaling, and sluggish motivation systems. It's like the engine is still running, but the gears won't engage. There remains considerable disagreement about what causes what. Does helplessness cause depression? Or does depression cause helplessness? Are they two faces of the same coin? Some researchers argue that learned helplessness is an early-stage response, and if it lingers long enough without relief, it turns into depression. Others think it's just a symptom of depression, not a cause. Either way, the overlap is undeniable. But depression brings its own unique shadows. While learned helplessness is often situation-specific, I can't change this thing, depression generalizes. I can't change anything. It swallows up entire categories of experience. Work, relationships, hobbies, health. Nothing feels worth it. Everything is gray. You might find this surprising. One of the most telling signs of this shift is not the presence of sadness, but the absence of reactivity. In learned helplessness, you may still react emotionally to failure, anger, frustration, disappointment. In depression, even those emotions can fade. You don't get mad. You don't feel scared. You just don't care. This emotional numbing is tied to something called blunted affect, where your ability to feel strong emotions, good or bad, dulls over time. And neurologically, this links back to serotonin, the neurotransmitter most commonly associated with mood regulation. In both animal and human studies, uncontrollable stress has been shown to reduce serotonin availability, particularly in the brainstem and frontal lobes. And then there's the default mode network, a part of the brain that activates during introspection and daydreaming. In depression, this network becomes hyperactive. You overthink, ruminate, replay the same failures over and over like a scratched record. You're not just helpless, you're haunted by it. Just a quirky detail, even fruit flies can display depression-like behavior. In one experiment, researchers exposed fruit flies to repeated failed mating attempts. Eventually, the flies stopped trying. They became lethargic, avoided other flies, and didn't explore their environment. Yes, fruit flies. It turns out even they can fall into a kind of tiny winged funk. Back in human territory, depression also warps time perception. Hours stretch. Days blend. You stop marking the passage of time by events or accomplishments. Instead, everything feels like it's happening in slow motion, or worse, not at all. This sense of timeless stagnation deepens the helplessness, because without movement, there's no progress. And without progress, why try? Here's the cruel irony: the very things that could help, movement, social connection, goal setting, are the hardest things to access when you're depressed. The brain wants evidence that effort matters before it invests energy. But the only way to get that evidence is by investing energy first. It's a catch-22, and the loop is maddening. But here's where things get hopeful again. Just like with learned helplessness, depression responds to small successes. Not overnight turnarounds or grand epiphanies, but tiny moments of proof. A meal cooked. A message sent. A short walk taken. Each one is a whisper to your brain: you still work. You still move. You still matter. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, one of the most effective treatments for depression, often begins with behavioral activation, getting people to engage in actions even if they don't feel like it. Because feelings often follow behavior, not the other way around. When you act, your brain begins to take note. Slowly, dopamine returns. Serotonin steadies. Motivation flares, then steadies. You don't leap back to life, you ease back into it. You might wonder, can you be stuck in learned helplessness without being clinically depressed? Absolutely. But the line is thin. Chronic helplessness, especially if it's gone unaddressed for years, can easily slip into depression territory. And often, people don't know the transition has happened until they start forgetting what hope used to feel like. That shift in emotional tone leads us gently into another realm, the roots of helplessness that form long before adulthood. Before you had words for these feelings. Before your brain had matured. Yes, we're about to go back in time, back to the earliest scripts you were given. Scripts you didn't choose, but that shaped how you now interpret challenge and effort. Because helplessness doesn't just show up one day. Often, it's planted early, in the soil of childhood experience, and the brain never forgets how those roots grew. Let's float gently backward now, into memory. Not the kind you can name easily, but the kind that lives in your bones, in how you react to failure, in how you brace for disappointment, in how quickly you give up before even trying. Many of those reflexes were shaped long ago, before you had a name for them. Childhood isn't just about toys and juice boxes. It's where the mind starts forming its rules of engagement with the world. And one of those rules, for some, is, trying doesn't matter here. Childhood is where learned helplessness often takes root. It's not always traumatic in the dramatic, movie scene way. Sometimes, it's quiet. Repetitive. A drip of invalidation. A look of disappointment. A sense that no matter what you did, it wasn't quite right, or worse, it didn't matter at all. Maybe you were the kid who cleaned your room without being asked but got no acknowledgement. Maybe you studied hard but were always told you could have done better. Or maybe you were the invisible one, doing your best, but never being noticed at all. These aren't just sad moments. They're learning events, and your young brain takes notes. Here's something interesting. Children begin developing their locus of control. That's psychology speak for how much control you believe you have over life events, between ages 7 and 10. If your environment teaches you that your actions lead to results, your brain leans toward an internal locus of control. I make things happen. But if your environment feels random, punishing, or indifferent, your brain drifts toward an external locus. Things just happen to me. And once that expectation sets in, it becomes a default lens. You carry it into adolescence, into relationships, into jobs. Even when things do respond to your effort, you may not notice it, because your brain isn't looking for that evidence anymore. An odd but true fact, in one study, children raised in orphanages with minimal adult interaction displayed significantly lower motivation to explore new environments, even when adopted into loving homes later on. The early experience of being ignored seemed to dampen their curiosity. Their brains had already concluded, there's no point in reaching out. You might find this surprising, but even well-meaning parenting can accidentally nurture helplessness. Overprotectiveness, for example, sends a subtle message: you can't handle this without me. An excessive punishment teaches a child, effort is risky. If kids are never allowed to fail safely, or if they're punished for failing, they stop associating effort with growth. Instead, they learn to freeze. There remains considerable disagreement about how much childhood helplessness stems from parenting styles versus broader environments. Some psychologists argue that school systems play a major role, especially ones that reward rote compliance over creative effort. Others believe temperament, the natural sensitivity or confidence of a child, can amplify or protect against these early messages. What's widely accepted, though, is that repeated failure without feedback teaches the brain to disengage. Just a quirky detail, studies on baby monkeys have shown that even they develop helpless behaviors if their caregivers are consistently unresponsive. They stop playing. Stop calling out. Their stress hormones rise, and they show the early primate versions of depression. Across species, connection and contingency, the idea that, I do something, and the world responds, is foundational to emotional resilience. So let's say your early world didn't respond well. Or it responded randomly. Or it punished your efforts. Your brain, always trying to make sense of chaos, develops a shortcut: don't bother. That phrase gets written not in words, but in habit loops. You pull away. You downplay your wants. You hesitate before speaking up. And when you do try and fail, it feels like confirmation, not just misfortune. What makes this even trickier is that many of these early scripts are unconscious. You're not walking around saying, I learned helplessness as a child. You're just noticing that you always let others decide, or that you feel emotionally paralyzed when asked to take initiative. You feel like an observer in your own life, not because you want to be, but because somewhere along the way, your brain decided that was the safest role. And safety, again, is the key. Your developing mind isn't just wired for learning, it's wired for survival. If effort seems unsafe, or irrelevant, or humiliating, your brain protects you the only way it knows how. It stops you from trying. It's not defiance. It's a defense. That's why simply being told, you can do it, as an adult doesn't always land. If your inner wiring was built around the opposite message, surface-level encouragement won't reprogram those older, deeper networks. You have to speak to the part of you that learned to expect failure before it could speak full sentences. Here's where hope re-enters the room. Neuroscience shows us that the brain remains plastic, changeable, even into late adulthood. Those old childhood patterns? They can be challenged. They can be rewritten. But the process often starts with awareness. You have to name the pattern before you can rewire it. It might start with noticing your resistance. I always shut down when I'm asked to lead. I expect people to dismiss me. I assume I'll fail at new things. These aren't weaknesses. They're echoes. Echoes of a child who tried once, or many times, and learned that effort didn't equal safety. You can even begin speaking to that part of yourself directly. Yes, this sounds corny. But it works. You tell that younger version of yourself, I hear you. I see why you stopped trying. But the rules are different now. We can try again. Self-compassion is not indulgent. It's biological healing. It re-engages the very circuits that once gave up. As your breath softens and your thoughts begin to settle, we drift now towards something a little sneakier, the illusion of control. Because not all helplessness looks like defeat. Sometimes, it looks like over-efforting. Over-planning. Perfectionism. And that, too, can be a disguise for helplessness in a different form. Let's gently lift the veil on that next. Not all helplessness looks like collapse. Sometimes, it looks like spreadsheets. Color-coded to-do lists. Waking up 3 hours early just to get ahead of the chaos. It looks like clenched jaws and brittle smiles and a mind that never, ever slows down. Because here's the paradox, the illusion of control can be just as much a symptom of helplessness as giving up altogether. It just wears better shoes. Imagine this, you're juggling everything: career, family, social life, errands. You say yes to everything because saying no feels dangerous. You're the one who organizes the trips, handles the problems, manages the details no one else notices. You're praised for being dependable, capable, on top of things. But underneath, there's often a quiet panic. A sense that if you stop spinning all the plates, everything, including you, will fall apart. That's not just busyness. That's control as armor. And it often grows from the same soil as helplessness, environments where effort didn't seem to work unless it was perfect. Or where love and safety were conditional on performance. You didn't give up, you overcompensated. Here's something interesting. In psychological research, This is sometimes referred to as secondary control, a coping mechanism where, instead of changing the external situation, you focus on controlling your inner response or immediate surroundings. It's a brilliant adaptation. If you grew up in chaos or unpredictability, becoming hypercompetent is one way to protect yourself. But over time, this strategy can become exhausting, and strangely, just as limiting as traditional helplessness. An odd but true fact: studies have found that individuals with high-functioning anxiety often score similarly on internalized helplessness scales as those with classic depressive symptoms. It's not always about what you're doing, it's about why you're doing it. Are you moving from agency, or from fear? The illusion of control gives you the feeling that you're doing something. That you're winning, or at least staying afloat. But if you dig beneath the surface, you'll often find the same core belief: if I don't do everything, nothing will work. And right beneath that, no one's coming to help me. That's where helplessness hides in plain sight. There remains considerable disagreement about whether perfectionism is a type of control issue, a trauma response, or a personality trait. Most experts agree it's probably a blend. For some, it's wired temperamentally. For others, it's a learned response to environments that punished mistakes or withheld affection. Either way, it becomes a strategy. If I can't feel safe, maybe I can feel certain. But certainty is slippery. And when life does what life always does, throws a wrench in your plans, your fragile sense of agency can crumble. That's when the overachiever crashes. The helper burns out. The control freak melts into the very thing they were avoiding: paralysis. You might find this surprising, but people with a strong illusion of control often struggle more with unexpected change than those who are openly disengaged. Why? Because their brain has tied safety to structure. And when that structure falters, the mind has no backup plan. It doesn't know how to let go. It only knows how to grip harder. Just a quirky detail: in one experiment, participants were given a button and told it could reduce loud noises in the lab. It didn't actually do anything, but participants who believed they had control reported significantly less stress than those who knew the button was fake. The mere illusion of agency was enough to calm the nervous system. Now imagine living your whole life pressing buttons that don't work. Eventually, even the illusion starts to feel hollow. You may have experienced this in smaller ways. Planning every detail of a trip, only to have weather cancel the event. Managing every possible detail at work, only to get laid off during downsizing. Even when you do everything right, the outcome isn't guaranteed. And that's the crack in the armor, the moment your illusion of control can't hold back reality. This moment can be terrifying. But it's also a turning point. Because when control breaks, you're forced to confront what's beneath it: your real capacity for adaptation, for surrender, for courage. That's where actual agency begins, not in micromanaging outcomes, but in choosing how you respond when they fall apart. Let's slow here, because this is delicate. If you've lived your life managing, fixing, perfecting, it's not a bad thing. It's not weakness. It's intelligence. It's survival. But it may not be sustainable. And sometimes, the most radical act of power is to not control something. To allow imperfection. To trust that trying, even if it doesn't work, is still worth it. That's how you begin healing from the illusion. By noticing when control becomes compulsion. When structure becomes rigidity. When the drive to do it all is driven by fear of what happens if you don't. You don't need to abandon organization or effort. But you can start checking your motive. Am I doing this because it brings me joy or clarity? Or because I'm terrified of what happens if I stop? That question alone can shift the power dynamic inside your mind. And here's the soft secret: sometimes, when you release control, life moves toward you. Help arrives. Solutions emerge. Your mind, once freed from constant micromanagement, begins to see more possibilities, not fewer. And so we move forward, gently, into the bigger picture. If the illusion of control is one layer of learned helplessness, then the next layer is its cultural shell. Because the environment you live in, its expectations, biases, and pressures, shapes how helplessness shows up. Let's look now at how the world teaches helplessness differently depending on who you are, where you're from, and what you're told you're allowed to want. Now let's zoom out, just a little. You've wandered through the chambers of your own mind, examined neurons, motivations, childhood echoes. But you don't live in a vacuum. Your brain learns not just from your private world, but from the culture wrapped around it. And culture, well, culture has a lot to say about who gets to feel powerful, and who is expected to stay small. Learned helplessness isn't only personal, it's often socially conditioned. From the roles you're taught to play, to the scripts you're subtly handed, to the cues your community gives you about who gets to act, lead, speak up, or rest, this is where helplessness gets baked into the system. Here's something interesting. Research shows that people in marginalized groups, whether based on race, gender, socioeconomic status, or ability, report higher levels of perceived helplessness. Not because they're weaker or less motivated, but because their lived experiences have taught them that effort often doesn't yield the same results. It's not pessimism. It's pattern recognition. Think about it. If every time you apply for a promotion, someone less qualified is chosen because they fit a certain look. If every time you raise a concern, you're labeled difficult or emotional. If your environment repeatedly shows you that your voice carries less weight, your brain eventually starts to say, why bother? This is known as structural learned helplessness, when your sense of futility is reinforced not just by personal failure, but by societal bias. And it often hides in plain sight. A teacher who calls on boys more than girls. A healthcare system that dismisses pain in certain racial groups. A media landscape that praises quiet compliance in some, and boldness in others. Over time, those cues teach your nervous system how much it's allowed to expect. A long-standing controversy surrounds the balance between cultural determinism and individual agency. Some argue that culture merely nudges behavior, and anyone can rise above their circumstances. Others insist that culture can profoundly limit what people believe they're capable of, especially when reinforced by authority figures or systemic obstacles. Like most things, the truth probably lives somewhere in the middle. But either way, the message your brain receives, loudly or quietly, shapes how much it believes you're allowed to try. Just a quirky detail. In one study, researchers found that women in math-heavy college programs performed worse on tests when reminded of gender stereotypes, even when they were objectively more qualified. It wasn't ability that changed. It was mindset. The simple cue of, people like you aren't supposed to do well here, was enough to disrupt performance. That's the social brain in action. And it's not just about gender. Think about class, too. If you grow up in a low-income household where resources are scarce and opportunities are limited, your brain starts forming beliefs about what's realistic. You may be brilliant, creative, and driven, but if your early world didn't reward those traits, you might never learn to trust them. Your neural network gets coded with scarcity. And even when circumstances change, that old script can stay lodged in place. This is why some people struggle to level up even when the opportunity arrives. Their nervous system hasn't caught up with their environment. You see this in the phenomenon known as imposter syndrome, that gnawing feeling that you don't belong, even when you've earned your place. It's not just insecurity. It's often the aftershock of cultural conditioning that told you, success isn't for people like you. You might find this surprising, even body language is culturally conditioned. Studies show that people who've experienced long-term discrimination often take up less physical space, shrinking their posture, avoiding eye contact, speaking more softly. Not because they're shy, but because their nervous systems have adapted to avoid conflict, to blend in, to stay safe. And over time, those physical patterns reinforce emotional ones. Helplessness can also be embedded in language. Think about phrases like, know your place, don't get your hopes up, people like us don't do that. They sound benign on the surface, but they plant seeds. Seeds that grow into mental ceilings. And once those ceilings are installed, your mind learns to stop looking for the skylight. This doesn't mean you're doomed to repeat history. But it does mean that healing from helplessness often involves challenging cultural scripts, not just personal beliefs. It means asking, whose story am I living? Whose rules am I obeying? And what would I do differently if I didn't think I had to follow them? Here's where the work gets both harder and more powerful. Because the brain isn't just learning about you, it's learning about what's possible. And if your environment consistently shows you that certain outcomes are off limits, it takes intentional unlearning to rewrite that script. This is where representation matters. Seeing someone who looks like you, lives like you, dreams like you, succeeding, activates a different pathway in the brain. It provides what psychologists call vicarious agency. If they can do it, maybe I can too. That one possibility, modeled by someone else, can reopen neural networks that were previously shut down. You don't have to overhaul your whole world to start that unlearning. It can begin with a book, a video, a conversation, a new environment, even 5 minutes in a place where your full self is welcomed. Your nervous system is always listening. It notices when the story shifts. It softens when it feels seen. And yes, culture can teach helplessness, but culture can also be rewritten. It happens slowly, through micro-revolutions. Through people telling the truth. Through someone saying no to silence. Through one person reaching for a possibility they were never supposed to believe in, and showing others it can be done. As your thoughts drift across these larger landscapes, let's begin shifting from the mind to the body. Because helplessness doesn't just live in your ideas, it lives in your posture, your muscles, your immune system. Your body remembers what your brain tries to forget. And it often tells the truth sooner. So now, let's walk gently into the embodied side of helplessness. What does it look like when your nervous system adapts to powerlessness? And how can your body become part of your healing? Your body is smarter than you think. Not in the IQ test kind of way, but in the deeply instinctual, quietly observant, always listening kind of way. While your mind spins its stories about trying, failing, waiting, or worrying, your body simply knows. And when learned helplessness takes root, it doesn't just echo in your thoughts, it settles into your limbs, your breath, your gut. You carry it, even when you don't realize you are. Maybe you felt it. That heaviness in your chest when facing a task you should be able to do. The slump in your shoulders when someone asks you to lead. The sudden fatigue when it's time to speak up. These aren't random symptoms. They're somatic imprints, physical expressions of psychological patterns. Here's something interesting. Researchers have found that people experiencing chronic helplessness often show reduced physical activity, lowered muscle tone, and changes in breathing patterns. Their bodies literally move less, take in less air, and rest in postures associated with submission or withdrawal. This isn't laziness, it's biology. The nervous system has shifted into a mode of conservation. This shift is part of what's known as the freeze response. You've probably heard of fight or flight, but the third option, freeze, is what your nervous system chooses when neither fighting nor fleeing feels safe. It's the play dead response. And in psychological helplessness, this freeze can last for days, months, even years. You might be going to work, paying bills, smiling at parties, but inside, your system is stuck in a quiet paralysis. You might find this surprising. Your immune system is also affected by helplessness. In animal studies, subjects exposed to uncontrollable stress showed weakened immune responses. The brain's belief that nothing I do matters signals to the body, no point in wasting resources. Healing slows. Inflammation rises. Even your skin heals more slowly under conditions of perceived powerlessness. An odd but true fact, posture studies have found that people who sit or stand in slumped positions for long periods are more likely to report feelings of hopelessness and reduced self-efficacy. On the flip side, simply adopting an open posture, chest lifted, head up, for even a few minutes has been shown to improve mood and increase testosterone while lowering cortisol. Your body can trick your brain into feeling more capable. In the best way. There remains considerable disagreement about whether these bodily responses are caused by helplessness or simply reflect it. Are you slouching because you feel powerless? Or do you start to feel powerless because your body has curled inward? The answer seems to be both. The relationship between body and mind is bidirectional. A loop. And you can intervene on either side. This is why somatic therapies, like yoga, breathwork, dance, or even trauma-informed bodywork, are increasingly used in the treatment of depression and anxiety. Because sometimes, you don't need to think your way into hope. You just need to move differently. Or breathe more deeply. Or lie on the floor and feel the weight of gravity holding you instead of pushing you down. Let's slow that thought down. Gravity isn't your enemy. Often, when you feel helpless, it feels like the world is pressing against you. But gravity can also be an anchor. A reminder that you're still here. That your body is real. That you are held, even when your thoughts say otherwise. Just a quirky detail: certain breathing patterns, especially long, slow exhales, stimulate the vagus nerve, which is part of your parasympathetic nervous system. This is the system that says, "You're safe now." It slows your heart rate, relaxes your muscles, and quiets your inner alarms. In states of helplessness, this nerve gets underused. But with regular breath practices, it can be reawakened, giving your body the signal to try again. And once your body starts to feel safe, your brain follows. That's the deeper point here: safety first, action second. The brain won't let you take healthy risks if your body is screaming, danger. That's why talk therapy alone sometimes stalls. If the nervous system is still stuck in freeze, no amount of insight will move the needle. You have to melt the ice first. And movement, gentle, deliberate, non-performative movement, is often the key. Even something as simple as walking outdoors can begin this process. The bilateral motion of walking helps regulate emotional processing. The change in scenery reorients your perception of possibility. The rhythm reconnects you to time, breath, and embodiment. It's not about burning calories. It's about reminding your nervous system that life moves. You may also notice how helplessness lives in your voice. Maybe it's soft, hesitant, unsure. Maybe you clear your throat a lot. Or trail off mid-sentence. Or find yourself defaulting to phrases like, "I don't know," or "whatever works." These aren't just habits, they're physical traces of learned helplessness in action. Your larynx, your voice box, is directly influenced by your vagus nerve. So when your system is in shutdown mode, your voice shuts down too. The good news? You can warm it back up. Humming, chanting, singing in the shower, even if you're off-key, can stimulate the vagus nerve and start coaxing your voice into bolder, steadier territory. Over time, you begin to sound like someone who believes in their own authority. And your brain listens to your voice. It hears the change, and starts to believe it. Here's a gentle reminder: you don't have to feel brave to move. You don't have to feel strong to speak. Your body can lead the way even when your mind is unsure. And once your body believes in movement again, the rest will follow. So as you lie there now, breathing slowly, maybe noticing the weight of the blankets or the rhythm of your own chest rising and falling, you've already taken the first step. You're noticing your body. You're reconnecting to it. And in that noticing, something stirs. Something old and wise and quietly powerful. The part of you that still wants to live. Let's keep following that thread into the next section, where we begin to shift from symptoms to solutions. Where we learn how tiny decisions, made consistently, begin to rebuild your sense of agency. Because the path out of helplessness? It doesn't start with fireworks. It starts with one small, doable step. And then another. This is where the tide begins to turn. Not with grand declarations or sweeping changes, but with something far more subtle, and far more sustainable. Tiny choices. The kind that seem too small to matter. The kind you almost don't notice. But together, they begin to rewire the very circuitry that learned to give up. One micro-decision at a time, your brain starts believing again. Not all at once. Not with a bang. But slowly, steadily, and gently. Let's say you decide to make your bed. Not because anyone will see it. Not because it solves anything. But because, for 10 seconds, you chose order. That's a signal. A signal to your brain that says, I still have influence here. And your nervous system, always listening, makes a note of it. We moved today, it says. We did something. And tomorrow, maybe you open the window. Just a crack. Just to let the light in. Again, it won't fix your problems. But it shifts something inside. A whisper of movement. A flicker of agency. One step at a time, you're teaching your mind that trying is safe again. That you don't have to be perfect, or even confident, you just have to act. Here's something interesting. Behavioral psychologists call this process successive approximation. It's the idea that complex behaviors can be built incrementally by rewarding closer and closer approximations of the final goal. You don't start by running the marathon. You start by putting your shoes on. Then walking around the block. Then jogging. The reward isn't the finish line, it's the consistency that tells your brain, we're back in the game. And guess what? Your brain loves this kind of progress. Even if it's minuscule. In fact, dopamine is more responsive to progress than to outcome. So when you check something off a list, even a small thing, you get a neurochemical nod of encouragement. It's not about the size of the action. It's about the story it tells your nervous system, we are not helpless. You might find this surprising. Some of the most effective interventions for learned helplessness involve doing things before you believe in them. This flips the usual motivation script. You don't wait until you feel like it. You do the thing first, and the feeling catches up later. This is what behavioral activation therapy is built on, getting people to engage in life even when it feels pointless. And at first, it will feel pointless. That's okay. Your brain has to see the results before it believes in them. That's why we start small. Drink water. Stand up. Step outside. These aren't chores. They're proof that your actions still affect your experience. An odd but true fact, even the act of imagining yourself completing a task activates some of the same neural pathways as doing it. So if you truly can't move yet, picture the movement. Picture tying your shoes. Picture taking a walk. Picture making that call. This kind of mental rehearsal gently preps your brain to act, and often reduces the resistance when you do. There remains considerable disagreement about the best starting point for breaking helplessness. Some argue for body-first interventions, others for cognitive shifts, and some for social connection. But almost everyone agrees on this: small, repeated actions beat big, unsustainable efforts. Your brain needs consistency, not intensity. And those small choices? They begin to stack. You do one thing, and maybe it leads to another. Maybe you make tea. Then maybe you reply to that one email. Then maybe you stretch. And with each step, a different part of your brain starts waking up. A part that remembers what it feels like to move with purpose. Just a quirky detail, in Japanese culture, there's a concept called kaizen, which means continuous improvement through small steps. Businesses use it, but so do individuals. It's the idea that tiny, consistent actions create lasting change. And it aligns beautifully with how the brain learns. You don't shock it into transformation. You coax it. This is especially important if your default setting has been either do nothing or do everything perfectly. Learned helplessness often comes with all or nothing thinking. If I can't fix everything, why fix anything? If I can't do it right, why bother? But that's not how healing works. Healing is messy, slow, and non-linear. Some days you'll move forward. Some days you'll pause. Both are progress. Here's one powerful reframing. Instead of measuring success by outcome, start measuring it by intentional action. Did you choose something, however small, that made your world a little more bearable today? That's enough. That's how the rewiring begins. You might say, okay, I did one thing. Now what? Now you repeat it. Or choose something else. Consistency isn't about doing the same thing every day. It's about staying in the loop. Once your brain sees that effort still leads to effect, even occasionally, it starts to update its map. The lights begin to come back on. This is where things start to feel lighter. Not fixed, not cured, not perfect. But different. Like your system is no longer frozen. Like the ground beneath your feet isn't quite so slippery. And that's the foundation for real change. Because when you realize you can make choices again, you also start to realize you can choose different thoughts, different interpretations, different stories. And that leads us into something deeper, the voice inside your head. The narrator of your experience. The part that either fuels helplessness or dismantles it. Next, you'll begin to rewire not just your actions, but your inner monologue. Because if your brain believes what it hears most often, then maybe it's time to start saying something new. It's been whispering to you all along, hasn't it? That voice in your head. The one that narrates your life like a moody podcast host, often underfunded, rarely cheerful. You're not doing enough. That won't work. Why even try? The inner monologue doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just hums along in the background, draining your energy drip by drip. But here's the twist, that voice? It isn't you. It's a script, one your brain has learned, rehearsed, and replayed so many times it started to sound like the truth. And if learned helplessness thrives on repetition, it makes sense that the way out begins with rewriting that inner dialogue. Thought by thought. Line by line. Here's something interesting. Cognitive psychologists have identified a group of thought patterns called cognitive distortions, mental shortcuts that often reinforce helplessness. Things like catastrophizing, if this doesn't work, everything will fall apart. Overgeneralization, nothing ever goes right for me. Personalization, it failed, so it must be my fault. Mind reading, they probably think I'm stupid. Each of these distortions acts like a funhouse mirror. They warp reality just enough to make it discouraging. And if you're caught in a helpless loop, your brain loves these shortcuts. They save time. They reinforce your evidence. And they feel strangely safe. But they're not facts. They're habits. Mental reflexes your brain developed to predict disappointment and protect you from it. Problem is, that protection eventually becomes a prison. That's where cognitive reappraisal comes in, a fancy term for changing the way you interpret a situation. You're not ignoring reality. You're just questioning your first reaction. You're shifting from, this will never work, to, it might work differently than I planned. From, I failed, to, I learned something. Just a quirky detail, MRI studies show that people who practice cognitive reappraisal regularly have more activity in their prefrontal cortex and less in their amygdala. Remember those two? The calm planner and the screaming alarm bell? That's the magic of reappraisal. It trains the brain to respond thoughtfully, not reactively. You might find this surprising. Even saying one more balanced sentence to yourself, out loud or silently, can change your physiological state. This is hard, but not impossible. That sentence sends a new signal to your nervous system. It activates different neural pathways than this is pointless. And with repetition, those new paths grow stronger. A long-standing controversy surrounds the role of positive thinking in recovery. Some researchers argue that too much optimism can become toxic, invalidating real pain or leading to denial. Others say hope is a biological necessity. The middle ground? Realistic optimism. Not everything's fine, but some things are hard, and I still have options. That's the tone you want your inner voice to take. Calm, flexible, curious. Not sugary. Not fake. Just grounded. And kind. So how do you change the script? Step 1, notice it. Catch yourself mid-thought. Ah, there's that voice again, telling me I'm going to fail. Don't argue. Don't shame it. Just notice. Step 2, name it. That's catastrophizing. That's an old script. Labeling the thought takes it out of the shadows. Step 3, challenge it. Is this always true? What else could be possible? Even one question cracks the script open. Step 4, rewrite it. You don't have to swing to the opposite extreme. Just nudge the thought toward balance. This probably won't work becomes, there's a chance it could work. Your brain learns through repetition, not drama. Here's something interesting. Some therapists recommend treating your inner voice like a roommate. If your roommate said the things you say to yourself, would you tolerate it? Would you trust them? Would you believe them? Probably not. So why let that roommate live rent-free in your skull? Another technique? Journaling the reframe. Write the unfiltered thought down. Then, right next to it, write a gentler version. I'm a failure becomes, I'm struggling, and that's human. Nobody cares becomes, it feels like that right now, but I haven't reached out. This practice builds new grooves in the brain's interpretive tracks. And if journaling feels like too much, start with language swaps. Instead of, I can't, try, I haven't yet. Instead of, I should, try, I could. These tiny shifts reintroduce agency, possibility, room to breathe. You might also explore the idea of a compassionate inner coach, a version of yourself that's wiser, kinder, and more patient. What would that voice say in hard moments? How would it talk to you after a setback? Probably not, you're an idiot. Probably something closer to, okay, that hurt. Let's regroup. Just like with physical habits, the hardest part of changing inner talk is consistency. At first, it feels fake. Like you're pretending. That's normal. Your brain is used to a certain tone, it's skeptical of change. But over time, as new thoughts become more familiar, they also become more believable. And here's the kicker, your self-talk affects your behavior. People who engage in regular cognitive reappraisal are more likely to persist after failure, to try new things, and to recover faster from setbacks. Their inner voice becomes a source of resilience, not resistance. Let's say you wake up tomorrow and think, this day is going to be awful. You can pause and ask, is that a fact? Or just a forecast? That moment of questioning? That's a pivot. That's your brain stepping out of autopilot and reaching for agency. And once your thoughts start shifting, your behaviors follow. You might try one more time. Speak up. Apply. Rest. Move. Whatever the next small right thing is, you'll be more willing to do it when your mind isn't narrating doom behind your eyes. As you begin to believe your own encouragement, something amazing happens. Your motivation returns. Your dopamine reactivates. Your sense of self stretches out of the fetal position and says, let's try again. So now, with the mental dialogue softening, the next stop is your brain's great superpower, neuroplasticity. Because everything you've done so far, every step, breath, word, or reframe, has been part of the rewiring process. And next, you'll learn how that process works, and how to keep it going, even on your hardest days. You've come a long way, through science and memory, mood and movement, all the way to the quiet space where thoughts begin to shift. And now, we open the door to something both ancient and futuristic, your brain's ability to change itself. Not by accident. Not overnight. But through the strange, beautiful, slow-blooming magic of neuroplasticity. This isn't just a buzzword. It's the real, biological process by which your brain rewires itself in response to experience. And the best part? It never really stops. No matter how long helplessness has shaped your habits or thoughts, your neurons can learn new routes. Your belief systems can be updated. Your motivational circuits can be revived. This isn't self-help fluff, it's hard neuroscience. Here's something interesting. Neuroplasticity used to be considered a young brain feature, only available in children. But recent decades of research have proved otherwise. Adults, even elderly adults, can grow new neural connections. Under the right conditions, intention, repetition, rest, and emotional salience, your brain will literally rewire itself to support the life you're trying to create. Now, this isn't as simple as, think good thoughts and your brain will change. Neuroplasticity isn't about blind positivity. It's about consistent input. Repeated behaviors, thoughts, and even emotional states tell your brain what to prioritize. So if learned helplessness taught your brain, effort leads to nothing, then neuroplasticity can teach it, effort leads to something. An odd but true fact, in a famous London study, the hippocampus, the area of the brain tied to spatial memory, was found to be physically larger in taxi drivers who'd memorized the city's winding streets. Their jobs reshaped their brains. Literally. And that same principle applies to you. If you rehearse agency, even in small ways, your brain grows to support it. You might find this surprising. Just 10 minutes of mindful attention to a positive action or reframe can boost plasticity. Not because you're forcing it, but because focused attention, especially when paired with movement or emotion, amplifies the brain's learning response. It says, "Oh, this matters. Let's build something around it." But here's the catch: your brain doesn't care whether what you repeat is helpful or harmful. It builds pathways either way. That's why negative ruminations, self-blame, and avoidance habits can feel so powerful. They're well-worn roads. Familiar grooves. You've practiced them for years, even decades. And they're efficient, even if they're painful. This is why creating change often feels exhausting at first. Because your brain is trying to lay new track, in terrain that's already mapped out for default disappointment. You're not just adding something new. You're choosing a harder path, until that path becomes a trail. Then a road. Then, eventually, the new default. There remains considerable disagreement about which techniques best support neuroplasticity. Some studies favor mindfulness meditation. Others focus on cognitive behavioral work. Some emphasize movement, sleep, social connection. But all of them agree on this: repetition plus emotion plus attention equals change. Think of it this way: repetition is the hammer. Emotion is the fire. Attention is the blueprint. When all three are present, your brain starts building something new. That might be the belief that your voice matters. Or that you deserve rest. Or that failure is survivable. Whatever the new belief is, it needs reinforcement. Over and over. Until your neurons stop asking, "Are you sure?" and start saying, "We know this path." Just a quirky detail: in some studies, stroke patients who imagined moving a paralyzed limb, without actually moving it, still triggered activity in the motor cortex. Over time, some even regained small amounts of movement. Imagined action was enough to spark reconnection. That's the power of attention and belief on neural growth. So how do you engage neuroplasticity in the healing of helplessness? Start small. Start specific. Choose one area where you want to reclaim agency. Maybe it's getting out of bed. Maybe it's calling a friend. Maybe it's believing that you're allowed to want things. Then repeat that action, or even the intention, daily. Not perfectly. Not forcefully. Just consistently. Your brain doesn't require heroics. It just needs evidence. You might say to yourself, "I don't believe this yet." That's okay. Keep saying the new thing. Keep doing the new thing. Belief will trail behind, like a curious little sibling, poking its head around the corner to see if it's safe to join you. Neuroplasticity is also deeply tied to rest. Your brain consolidates new patterns during sleep. That means if you're pushing yourself relentlessly without time to reset, the changes won't stick. Rest isn't a reward for progress, it's a requirement for rewiring. So let yourself have slow days. Let the silence in. Let the new ideas settle. You can also amplify plasticity through play. Yes, play. Trying new things, even silly ones, lights up multiple brain regions and encourages flexibility. Cook a new recipe. Dance terribly in your kitchen. Try juggling. These aren't just hobbies. They're neural improvisation. They help your brain remember that newness isn't dangerous, it's exciting. And when setbacks happen, and they will, try this reframe: this is part of the learning curve. Your brain learns most from error correction, not success. When something doesn't go as planned and you try again, the brain says, We're adapting. That's how resilience forms. Not in perfection, but in persistence. Here's something deeply comforting. You don't have to get it right every time. You just have to keep returning. Neuroplasticity is forgiving. It doesn't require linear progress. It just needs you to show up, again and again, with curiosity and care. Eventually, what felt impossible becomes familiar. The actions you had to force become automatic. The self-talk you had to script becomes instinct. And the heaviness that once pinned you down begins to lift, not all at once, but surely, gradually, unmistakably. You start to feel not just less helpless, but actively powerful. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady. Like a current running underneath your skin. And that current? It's yours. Which brings us, finally, to where you are now. The gentle crest at the edge of this path. Not the end, but a new beginning. Where helplessness no longer drives, but rides quietly in the back seat. And the steering wheel? That's yours again. Let's close this journey by imagining what that freedom feels like, what life looks like without helplessness at the helm. So now you're here, standing at the quiet edge of something that once held you captive. The weight of helplessness has shifted, even if just slightly. You've named it. Unpacked it. Walked through its roots in your mind, your body, your culture, and your childhood. And something in you is beginning to understand, this wasn't weakness. It was protection. It was your brain doing its best with what it had. But now? Now you have more. More insight. More tools. More awareness. And more choice. You can feel it, can't you? That slight tilt in the air, like the first breeze after a storm. It doesn't mean the road is clear forever. But it does mean the engine can start again. And that is everything. What does freedom from learned helplessness actually feel like? It feels like opening the window not because you have to, but because you want to. Like trying again, not with desperation, but with quiet curiosity. It's not about becoming unstoppable, it's about learning that stopping doesn't mean the end. It just means you rest. And then you resume. It looks like honoring small wins instead of dismissing them. You washed the dishes? That counts. You went outside for 5 minutes? That counts. You interrupted one negative thought with a better one? That counts. The helpless brain is binary, it tells you you're either failing or fixed. But healing is grayscale. And freedom lives in those in-between shades. Here's something interesting. People who recover from long-term helplessness often describe a sense of returning. Not becoming someone new, but remembering who they were before the fog set in. Their preferences come back. Their opinions. Their laughter. Their hunger, for food, for connection, for experience. This isn't transformation. It's reunion. Just a quirky detail. In long-term space travel, astronauts report needing time to reorient when they return to Earth. Their bodies have adapted to low gravity, and it takes effort to walk upright again. But the capacity was always there. Just like yours. You haven't forgotten how to move forward, you've just been living under different conditions. A long-standing debate in psychology asks, is there such a thing as a true, set point for motivation? Are some people just born resilient, or does it all come down to experience? The science leans toward experience. And experience is something you can still shape, right now, even here in the soft hum of this moment. Because you've already started. Every section, every idea, every breath you've taken while listening, each one has quietly signaled to your brain, we're learning again. We're hopeful again. We're waking up. Even lying still, you've been moving. You might find this surprising, even recalling a time when you overcame something difficult activates neural networks related to agency. So if you need fuel, revisit your wins, no matter how small. There was a time you didn't think you could get through something, and you did. That memory is a map. Follow it. So what now? Now you keep going. Slowly. Gently. with fewer expectations and more wonder. You'll still have moments of doubt. That's okay. Doubt is just a leftover echo of the old wiring. But your new circuitry is growing. And every time you take action in the face of it, you strengthen your agency. You start trusting your voice again. You notice you can say no or yes without a full-blown anxiety spiral. You might even feel like trying something new, not because you're sure you'll succeed, but because you're finally okay with not knowing the outcome. That's real freedom. And the people around you? They'll notice the shift. The way you hold yourself. The way you speak. The way you no longer carry defeat like a second skin. You'll inspire others without even trying, just by showing that it's possible to come back to life. Quietly. Gradually. Honestly. So take this with you: helplessness is learned, yes, but so is hope. And tonight, you've been learning hope. Repetition by repetition. Neuron by neuron. Breath by breath. It's okay to be new at this. It's okay to be slow. It's okay if all you do tomorrow is one small thing. The system is already changing. The path is already forming. You don't have to sprint. You just have to continue. Let's ease now into the final few minutes. Let everything soften. No more effort needed. No more questions. Just you, your breath, and the quiet knowledge that you're already healing. So now, let your thoughts dissolve a little. You don't have to carry any more ideas for tonight. Let the vocabulary fade, the science rest, the effort uncoil. You've done enough. More than enough. Let your breathing deepen, even if just slightly. Let your shoulders fall an inch or two closer to the bed. Notice the way the air still moves, even when you're still. That movement, soft, automatic, easy, is a reminder life flows, even in rest. Especially in rest. Maybe your thoughts flicker here and there. That's okay. Just notice them like clouds moving across the sky. No need to follow. No need to analyze. Just let them pass. Your mind doesn't need to be empty. Just calm. Just quiet enough for peace to peek through. Remember, the part of you that reached for this tonight, the part that chose to listen, to learn, to understand, is the same part that's still here. Awake. Capable. Whole. You haven't lost yourself. You're just returning home. You don't need to plan tomorrow. You don't need to be better, smarter, stronger by morning. All you need to be is rested. And you're on your way. Let the last of this story drift away now. Let the silence widen around you like a soft blanket. Let your body sink, let your thoughts slow, let yourself, for tonight, just be. Before you settle in, feel free to like the video if it brought you a little peace, and if you'd like to join us again, we'd love to have you back. Subscribe when you're ready. No pressure, just rest. Share something if you feel like it. Let's slowly drift into tonight's quiet moments together.